It is known to many as the battle for the beer barrel. It is Kentucky and Tennessee on the gridiron, with the Vols leading all-time 79-25 with 9 ties. It is, of course, a rivalry month here at Mark Rogers TV as we highlight college football and the distinction this game has over any other when it comes to bad blood and rivalries and tradition and prestige. We bring in Mike LaValle and Kevin McGuffey. They both join us from Last Word on College Football to break down the Vols and the Cats. Gentlemen, we always appreciate the support and you guys jumping on board here and providing even more insight for college football fans here. So, Mike, we'll start with you because as an outsider who's watched this game a number of times, keeps up with college football across the board, you know, I think Tennessee and I think Kentucky, and on the football field, not much of a comparison here. But rivalries are much more than just the series ledger. And for this one, there's a unique quality to it that I think you can definitely speak to.
Yeah, first off, thanks for having us, Mark. Always a pleasure joining Mark Rogers TV. A lot of modern college football fans might see this rivalry, 79 wins to, I believe, 20 losses for Tennessee, 113 games. So there's something there if you've played a team 113 times. Obviously, that makes a rivalry. But a lot of modern college football fans might not understand kind of what makes this unique, at least for Tennessee fans. When you look at the historical rivals of Tennessee, Alabama, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and then in the modern era, Florida and Georgia kind of a historic rivalry as well. Kentucky is kind of unique in a couple different ways. One, a lot of people don't realize this, but the two schools are close to each other. Kentucky is Tennessee's closest rival, only by about 10 miles against Vanderbilt by drive. Of course, Georgia's a little bit closer as the crow flies, but you have to drive around the mountains. So as far as the drive goes, Kentucky is Tennessee's closest rival. But the other thing is, you know, when you look at where the schools are and kind of the culture in the area where the schools are located, I think Tennessee relates to Kentucky. Those two schools culturally, at least for the majority of their history, have been much more similar. If you look at Tennessee's in-state rival, Vanderbilt, Nashville's always, Knoxville's grown. It's much more of a metropolitan city now, metropolitan area now, but Nashville's kind of always been the metropolitan part of Tennessee. Knoxville's always been up in the Appalachian Mountains, up, kind of the elevation in Tennessee. So kind of the Appalachian part of Tennessee. Alabama, they're flatlanders. It's quite a distance away. The Alabama rivalry has always been about wins and losses. That's the one that's about the ledger, as you talked about. So, and Vanderbilt's, of course, the in-state rivalry that's just naturally there. Florida's kind of that modern rivalry that Dave Waters and I talked about here on Mark Rogers TV last week. And then Florida and Georgia, both. Tennessee doesn't have the number of games against those teams because they didn't play every year like Tennessee and Kentucky has. So you have the 113 games, and you have the cultural aspect about how both are kind of schools in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, kind of located for at least the majority of their history in kind of rural areas. And so the two schools, it might not be so much about leisure here as it is about the culture and the identity of the area of which the schools are located. I think that's what makes Kentucky rivalry unique for Tennessee fans. And, of course, Tennessee fans enjoy the ledger as well, 79 wins over 113 years.
Kevin, your thoughts about Kentucky, Tennessee. Why is this one special to you besides being a Kentucky fan and wanting to win football games?
Well, as Mike said, it's 25 wins, by the way, for Kentucky. Just want to throw that out there. Got to give us those other 5 wins. No, I think Mike makes a very good point. Like I say, it's a 2-state schools. It's it's a 3-hour drive from here, from Lexington to Knoxville. Like I said, a lot of things, Mike said, it's very these two schools started playing, in the late 1800s. They were charter members of the SEC. You have that rivalry that goes back, ages. Like I said, going up for many years or a few years, it was pretty even. And then, Kentucky hit the 1980s and kind of hit the skids, for lack of a better term. But like I said, the two schools are very similar. I think, Kentucky wants to be right there with Tennessee. That's the next step, with Mark Stoops, with the program, Kentucky's won 2 out of the last, 7 years. That doesn't sound like much, but for a Kentucky fan, that's pretty good. But like I said, to go on with Mike's point, like I said, various schools are very similar, very, very, very similar.
Hey, you know, Mark, I'll just add one thing else that makes the rivalry unique is you kind of have the switching of sports. So if you turn it and look at basketball, you have that interesting tennis. To me, I don't want to speak for Kentucky fans. I don't want to make a mistake, but to me, it seems like Kentucky fans always measure their football progress by how close they're getting to Tennessee. For Tennessee basketball fans, we always measure our basketball progress with how close are we getting to Kentucky. And so in football, particularly in the SEC East, since the SEC went to 2 divisions, Kentucky, in order to get to the top of the East, they've got to get past that traditional hump of Tennessee. And basketball, for Tennessee to get to the top of the SEC conference, we've got to get past that traditional hump of Kentucky. Tennessee's the top. You cannot argue they're not top 15. You can argue they're top 10 historically in college football. Obviously, Kentucky is a top 5 college basketball program. So, this rivalry between the 2 schools, it kind of mirror images. The 2 main revenue generating sports, football and basketball, are kind of mirror images of each other. I think that's another thing that kind of plays into this rivalry as well. It's not just during football season. It kind of flips 180 degrees during basketball season. So it's kind of a year-long rivalry. Tennessee doesn't have that with Georgia or Alabama, a little bit with more so with Vanderbilt, and then a little bit with Florida with the double sports. But Tennessee doesn't have that with a lot of teams. They do have that uniqueness with Kentucky, and it's almost a mirror image. Tennessee football is probably not as historic as Kentucky basketball, but then again, Kentucky football probably has not had as strong legacy as Tennessee basketball. So you see that interesting 180-degree flip between basketball and football. So I think that makes it kind of a unique rivalry as well.
So when looking at the origin of this rivalry and what was the catalyst of making it a rivalry, was it simply the bordering state factor? And I'm guessing that the 2 campuses are probably roughly 4.5 to 5 hours apart, I would guess.
2.5.
Yeah,
okay. 2.5 if you drive
about 3 hours.
Okay.
I don't know about Kevin drives. 2.5, 2:45 if you drive like I do.
Okay.
But you got to stay the speed limit. Yeah, 2.5 to 3 is about right. Yeah.
Yeah, but so Kevin, when you think about this rivalry, what comes to mind? Obviously, you're clinching onto those 2 wins in the last 7 meetings. Before that, there wasn't a whole lot. I'm looking at the scores through the years and the trends, which the trends are basically globs of orange and a smattering of blue in there. But Kentucky last won as a ranked team. 7th ranked in the country in 1977, defeating the Vols 10-7. And then Tennessee basically won every meeting and was ranked from 1987 to 07, which, of course, was the end of the Philip Fulmer era. The other thing about Tennessee is I think you might set a record, Mike, for rivals, like legitimate rivals. Florida, Georgia, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Alabama, half the schedule's rival.
Yeah, no doubt. And again, going back to your earlier question about the origins of the rivalry, I've talked about this a lot. I think we get away in college football, in the modern college football era, we get away from the essence of the sport. And college football is a regional sport. So when you talk about the early era of college football, Kevin mentioned that this rivalry started in the 1800s. The 1800s, the first half of the 1900s, those schools being close to each other. And again, the cultural impact from those communities being kind of similar culture. That's really what the origins is. And then you can't forget, Bear Bryant coached in Kentucky. So when you're talking about importance in the historical aspect, you do have that Bear Bryant. Of course, he went from Kentucky, ended up at Alabama, which of course ties in again. You mentioned Tennessee has a lot of rivals, ties into that. I think when you talk about the number of rivals that Tennessee has, geography plays a little bit into it. Of course, Vanderbilt's the in-state rival that we talked about. Kentucky's close. Georgia, as the crow flies, is actually the closest school to Tennessee. Then you have the ledger, what I think, I'd steal a term from you, what I would call the ledger rivalries. Alabama, we've talked about this before. Tennessee has historically been the number 2 team in the SEC. Of course, we're trying to get over Alabama. And then Florida, the modern day rivalry for Tennessee. They've had our number. Kevin knows this feeling. Kevin knows the feeling of Florida having your number as well. So yeah, half of our schedule is rivals, and that takes a toll on a fan base because you've got you especially want to win and have good records against your rivals. And so with Tennessee, no offense to Big Blue Nation, but it's good that we have Vanderbilt and Kentucky there because in recent memory we haven't had a lot of success against Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. So it's kind of good to have Kentucky as one of those 5 historic rivals there.
It's Rivalry Month here at Mark Rogers TV. Tennessee, Kentucky, center stage here at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. Mike Laval and Kevin McGuffey from Last Word on College Football. And Kevin, considering how much orange paints the past, 79-25 with 9 ties, you get to feel pretty good where the programs stand now and what the future could hold for Kentucky gaining some more wins in the series.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And going back to Mike's point, I think there's some Kentucky fans who would, you can win, 2 football games a year, beat Louisville, beat Tennessee. Of course, that's not going to get you to a bowl game, but still, like I said, Kentucky is trying. They're getting, we think getting better every season, and Tennessee is that measuring stick. As Mike said, they've been, the cream of the SEC. Especially in the East for a number of years. The last few years they've been a little bit down, but I think Jeremy Pruitt was a wonderful hire for them, and I would not be surprised within a year or two to see them right back up at the top of the league. Like I said, Kentucky, they're trying every year, trying to get better. Like I said, Tennessee is a big measuring stick, and if we just want to be competitive. You're not saying you're going to beat Tennessee every year, but once out of every, at least beat them at home. Beat them up here. If you lose, in Knoxville, so be it. But like I said, Kentucky's 2 biggest rivalries are, Tennessee and Louisville, and Kentucky's had good success against Louisville over the last few years, but not as much against Tennessee. But like I said, they're trying, a win against Tennessee where you're getting competitive, like I said, a win every couple of years, every 2 or 3 years. That's what this program is striving for. And if they can get to that point, they'll maybe take that next step up in the league.
Mike, I would think that Tennessee has an inherent advantage as I kind of scan rivalries across the country. Most of them are in-state. Therefore, there's not an advantage in regards to a recruiting footprint. Texas would have the lead over Oklahoma if they could just keep the kids in state versus what they have in the Sooner State. And Ohio State, a bit of an advantage over Michigan because more and better football talent there. Does Tennessee have a little bit better high school football players at this point?
Yes, and certainly, I particularly think in the last 10 years, particularly in the last 5 years, you've seen, we've talked about the number of 5-star recruits per capita coming out of Tennessee. Certainly, it's not Louisiana. And when you look at the recruiting hotbeds, you got Florida and Atlanta. Tennessee has historically recruited very well in Atlanta. Again, Tennessee, the University of Tennessee is close to Atlanta, only a 3 or 4 hour drive from Atlanta. Plus, we're closer to Florida. In this day and age, with the digital era, with Huddle and big time college football programs having private jets, I don't think the geography matters much. Certainly the in-state does. Tennessee, my opinion is Tennessee does have better high school football, but you can't forget, Louisville's got a couple big-time programs. Trinity and St. X come to mind. They're in Louisville, great programs, historic high school programs. And then people oftentimes forget that half of Cincinnati is basically in Kentucky. So you have a little bit of a recruiting area there. But between Memphis, Nashville, and Knoxville, Memphis is kind of between Tennessee and Ole Miss and Memphis. But between Middle Tennessee and the East Tennessee area, I do believe recruiting is the high school sports are better in Tennessee. Plus, Tennessee has a couple pipelines into Atlanta. But you go back and look, Kentucky's produced some great athletes. Randall Cobb playing for the Packers, that was a big, a lot of Tennessee fans kind of were not happy that Tennessee didn't aggressively recruit him. Tennessee did aggressively recruit Tim Couch, great quarterback that I think threw for about 100,000 million yards at Kentucky, was one of the vaunted Browns quarterbacks, one of the 113 starting Browns quarterbacks in the last 10 years or 15 years.
One of the better ones.
Yeah, one of the better ones.
The last quarterback to get the Browns to the playoffs was Tim Couch.
But Tennessee,
unfortunately, he got hurt. I think in the last game of the season, didn't actually play in the playoffs game. But
Kelly Holcomb played.
Do what?
Kelly Holcomb played against the Pittsburgh Steelers.
That's right. Kelly Holcomb.
And of course, the tie-in there is Kelly Holcomb went to Lincoln County High School in Middle Tennessee, Southern Middle Tennessee. So there's your Tennessee high school link there backing up Tim Couch out of Kentucky. Go ahead, Mark.
Real quick about Tim Couch, somebody mentioned to me the other day they couldn't believe that Tim Couch was going into the College Football Hall of Fame. And you guys know how certain college football fans and sports fans in general think in the past about players, and they think, oh, Tim Couch, and they automatically associate him with his NFL career, although it is the College Football Hall of Fame. And I quickly jumped on College Football Reference to point out that Tim Couch led the nation in attempts, completions, yards, touchdowns, 2 consecutive seasons there at Kentucky, and took a 4-win program to consecutive bowl games and fringe top 25 type finishes. So he definitely earned that induction.
Yeah, certainly. Couch threw it across all over the field. But yes, to answer your original question, I do believe high school football is better in Tennessee, particularly with Nashville and Knoxville markets. But there's been a couple of athletes, a couple of great athletes that came from Kentucky. Good athletes come from Kentucky all the time. But I was just pointing out, between Cobb and Couch, the great story at Tennessee is that Fulmer thought they had Couch, but he just couldn't. He couldn't. At a point, I think he had told Fulmer he was going to come to Tennessee, but then he changed his mind. He just could not go away from his in-state school at Kentucky. So they're obviously great high school players in Kentucky, but I do believe Tennessee has the advantage with high school, particularly in the last decade when Tennessee high school football has gotten really good. Probably one of the top 10 recruiting areas in the nation.
We have a number of people on the chat. Kevin, I'll point out one comment that you'll like, because somebody already predicting, Ryan Mell predicting a Kentucky victory this year with Terry Wilson and Benny Snell both rushing for 100 yards in that game.
Hey, I'll take it. I saw one of the early, predictions that Kentucky was, I think, a 1 or 2 point favorite, in the early lines against Tennessee, which is, kind of hard to believe. But yeah, the Kentucky, going back to this year's team, I think it's interesting. He already has Terry Wilson as quarterback. Gunnar Hope may have a little something to say about that. But yeah, whoever it is, give the ball to Benny and get out of the way. So, I think Snell is going to have a huge season this year. He needs a little over 1,400 yards to become the school's all-time leading rusher. And I think he'll get it. And I also think this will be his last year here in Lexington. I think he'll declare for the draft after next season. But what Mike was saying, like I said, the Louisville, as far as recruiting, probably the last 5 to 7 years, high school, and, coaches will even admit it, high school talent in Kentucky had been down. And for whatever reason, I guess it goes, sometimes goes in circles or in cycles. But, the last few years, you've seen a lot of these guys playing at Kentucky now, like the Cash Daniels and, players like that. Kentucky and Tennessee play every year. I don't know what the record is, but, they play a high school all-star game every year. And I don't know what the record is on that, but I'm sure Tennessee's probably leading in that too. But like I said, you're talking about, about Tim Couch, going back to him, he finished, people, like I said, forget, the kind of stats he had, when Hal Mumme came here in 97 and, with him, Tony Franklin, who's now, offensive coordinator at Middle Tennessee, unleashed the air raid offense. It was a lot of fun, watching those games. He finished 4th in the Heisman, I believe it was, in 98. And I think, he should have been higher, but that's, my biased opinion. But like I said, going back to, as Mike said, the Louisville area with Trinity and St. X, and even like, Louisville Male, places like that. And then, as you said, with the Covington area, Fort Thomas Highlands, is usually a traditional power. You think about, Jared Lorenzen, the round mound of, touchdown, that played quarterback for Kentucky in the early 2000s. He's a guy that comes to mind. And like I said, the high school players, the cycle now is turning upwards, and you're seeing a lot of these really good guys, that are staying here in state and playing at Kentucky. And Tennessee, with the exception of Randall Cobb, honestly, Tennessee is not really an area Kentucky's recruited a whole lot. You see, like now, you see them, with Vince Marrow and those guys, they hit Ohio, hard. They hit Florida hard. That's, if you look at their roster, there's guys from Kentucky, but then you see, half the recruiting class is from Ohio and Florida.
I'm checking out the Tim Couch years, 97-98 against Tennessee. He faced two pretty good Vols teams, one ranked in the top 5, one number 1 that obviously went on to win the first BCS national championship, and two pretty good quarterbacks, one in particular, one of the top 5 in the history of the NFL. The other won a national championship, of course, in T. Martin. In both of those games, let's see, 59-21 and 59-31. As I'm sure Couch threw for a ton of yardage, but also probably 3 or 4 picks against Al Wilson and company, and some really good secondaries there at Tennessee. So, Mike, what comes to mind when you think Tennessee, Kentucky? Does any particular game or group of games stand out to you?
Well, I think when you think Tennessee, Kentucky, you think of the 79 wins and 113 seasons. So you just think of that ledger first. If you're a Tennessee fan, you kind of understand the cultural impact that I talked about earlier. You go back to those 90s, and in the decade of the 90s, I think Tennessee had 6 of 7 years where they scored 50 points or more. I think 7 of 8 of those years they had 48 points or more that whole decade. And so that, you think of the 80s and 90s as just a decade of dominance in the rivalry. But then, like kind of Kevin mentioned, we're kind of prisoners of contemporary thought. Tennessee has given up 400 yards, I think, plus to Kentucky the last 2 years. Benny Snell's a great running back, of course. 2011 was the year we lost the 26-year streak. So you immediately think of the 26-year streak. 2011 was the year we lost that. That was the Tyler Bray game, as Tennessee fans kind of liking that. Kentucky threw out a third-string quarterback, who was a wide receiver. I think the guy's name was Roark.
Yep, Matt Roark. He became a legend in Kentucky football history.
Tyler Bray and the seniors were kind of facing the arduous task of another 4 weeks of practice if they won that game. So he was noticeably off that game and ended the 26-year win streak. So Tennessee fans do not have a very fond memory of that game for various reasons. You think of 2008, Phil Fulmer's last game. Of course, Phil Fulmer is a beloved coach there. The reason Kentucky can't or could not recruit in Tennessee was because you're not taking a Tennessee guy away from Phil Fulmer in the 90s and 2000s. That's not going to happen. Even today, to get the 2 5-stars out of Higgins and Martin out of Knoxville, you got to be Clemson to come in and get those guys out of Knoxville. So you think 2008 Fulmer's last game, to the 2011 the Tyler Bray game, the 26-year streak, and of course Kentucky had to contend with Tennessee being a 26-year streak, and then you guys had to contend with Florida being a 30-year streak. Is that correct? And then
it's 30-31 now. Last time Kentucky beat Florida was 1986. So
and then if you do research,
before the 2011 game, it was 1984. The last time Kentucky beat Tennessee. So.
And then when you go back into the research, you see the wins that Tennessee had against Bear Bryant when he was at Kentucky. So those are kind of the games that stick out with me, the 26-year streak, the Tyler Bray game, Fulmer's last game. But Kevin's right. They gassed us for 400 yards 2 straight years, and if we can't shore up our run defense, Kentucky's going to have a streak of 2 at the end of this year. So those are the kind of things that stick out to me as far as on field and on the ledger. Again, that 90s where we scored 50 points, I think 6 out of 7 years, and then the 26-year streak, and then Fulmer's last game.
Kevin, I know Tennessee's been one of the top programs in the country, as Mike mentions, certainly in the top 15, most likely in the top 10 in the history of college football. In Florida, one of the top 5 or 10 in the last 20 or 25 years. But man, this is a rough go to be a Kentucky fan when you start throwing out 31 straight and 26 straight within your own division.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's all you can say is, yep. You and I have talked about this before, last year's game, much like if you go back and look at some of those games, especially, in the late 2000s, Kentucky had their chances, 2007 and 2009 are both games that pop into your head immediately, where Kentucky and Tennessee went in. Talking about Tennessee right now, went into, the 2007 game was 3 overtime game. And I think the 2009 game went into overtime. But yeah, like so, last year was probably the most frustrating, and I've vented about this many times, was probably the most frustrating as a Kentucky fan was that Florida game last year. Because if they were ever going to break the streak, last year was it. I was sure this was it. It was going to happen. And then what happens? They forget to cover a wide receiver, not once, but twice during the game, leading to 2 Florida touchdowns. And then Kentucky, even after that, Kentucky has a chance to win. They get what many people said was a bogus holding call that took them out of field goal position, and Austin McGinnis still almost made almost a 60-yarder to win the game. But yeah, I mean, as we were talking about earlier, to try to get consistency with the program, you have to be, you want to get the part. I'd read something earlier this week where somebody said, what would you think for consistency with Kentucky? And their answer was not getting blown out in a game this year. Whether it's, Georgia losing 42-10 or, Louisville, last year, beat them up pretty well.
Mississippi State.
Yeah, the Mississippi State game, exactly. Now, and you think about, Dan Mullen was 8-1 against Kentucky, and now he's at Florida. So, there you go. But what's probably going to happen is that with the Florida streak, something's going to happen like what happened in 2011. Just something crazy off the wall, where a third string, quarterback wide receiver basically comes in and plays quarterback, and Kentucky wins. It's going to be some kind of weird fluke that nobody's expecting, and that's when they're going to break the streak against Florida. But like I said, the 97 game, I was at that game you guys are talking about with Tim Couch and Peyton Manning. It was one of the most incredible games I've ever seen. I think the final totals, I had it written down somewhere. I think Couch had 470 some yards and 3 touchdowns, and Manning had 523 yards and 5 touchdowns or something like that. And, and the thing about was when Hal Mumme was here, basically Kentucky would score, and then he would just onside kick like every time. And like maybe one time you would get it, but then the other 4 times, Tennessee or whoever falls on the ball and they start on the 40-yard line. You give Peyton Manning, 40 yards, boom, they're going to score. But anyway, but yeah, like I said, the streaks are frustrating. Last year was just the topper for Florida, and there's been other chances. 2003, even a couple years ago down in the swamp where the bogus, as some people like to say, the bogus delay of game penalty that wasn't called, led to a Florida touchdown, which they went on to win in overtime. But those things happen. You can't harp on those. I mean, you can, but it just makes you sour grapes.
They happen when you're playing Florida a lot.
Well, yeah, things are bad when you give up 2 big pass plays to that Florida passing game. That thing's been pretty abysmal for a while now. And Kevin, I know that you're beaten down when you're facing a foe in Tennessee that just came off a winless SEC season, and you appear to be a little bit on better footing right now, and you're just hoping to split these games and win the home games. I think you can set your sights a little bit higher than that, Kevin.
Yeah, you can, but it's just the what we like to call it's the long-suffering UK football fan. It's like you hope for the best but expect the worst. And so you hope that you'll beat, you can beat Tennessee, you can beat Florida, maybe even, beat Georgia. Kentucky's beaten Georgia a couple times in the last decade. But, like I said, you want to go in every game thinking you're going to win, and, you want to be positive. But like I said, you just, all the years of, just seeing it like, almost like Charlie Brown, okay, well, here's the point where this is going to happen, and boom, there it is, and how do you not, like last year, cover the receivers? And it's just been, it's just been one thing after another. But like I said, the consistency that they're going to, I think Stoops is doing a fine job. And I think, they're taking each step, getting a little bit better each year. Their schedule is a little more difficult this year. I don't know, 7-5 may be pushing it, but that Tennessee game could be the swing game this year down in Knoxville.
Okay, your guy on here, Kevin Ryan, likes you to go 8-4. He's got losses to Georgia, Mississippi State, Texas A&M, and Florida. 8-4 for the Cats, 5-7 for the Vols. And as you well know, Mike, you got the rough draw out of the SEC Western Division this year with Alabama and Auburn.
Yeah, well, Alabama being the historical rivalry, so we get them every year. I think most Tennessee fans are okay with that. That's the way it should be. If you don't like losing to them, then start beating them. That's kind of the philosophy there. Auburn's a good team, but there's not a lot of bad teams in the SEC West. There's not a lot of bad teams in the SEC East. When you talk about the sob story of the Kentucky fan, I think it just goes to show how tough this conference is, and how tough it has always been. If you're a team like South Carolina, you get Spurrier there. You have the best seat. You have the best decade you've ever had. If you're a Kentucky fan, and you have Stoops there, and you brand new facilities. You're putting checkerboards in your end zones now. You got naming rights for a stadium there. You're a team like
don't get me started on the checkerboards. Anyway,
you're a team like Missouri. To get to the top of just the division, to get from 5th, 6th, 7th place in the division up to 2nd, 3rd, or 4th. You've got to break that 30-year streak to Florida. You got to break 2 wins in 28 years against Tennessee. Then you got to beat Georgia. Oh, by the way, who played for the national championship last year. And it's just so hard. We talk conferences every now and then. And look, there's a lot of good teams in college football, and it's hard to win every conference. But if you just look at the SEC for years now, decades, and you look how hard it is for a team like Kentucky or South Carolina, and even Tennessee now in their decade of dysfunction, where they've kind of fallen out of that triumvirate that led the East for so many years, just to get back up. It's not a matter of getting a good team and getting back up to that number 1, number 2 position, but you also have to jump 2 or 3 or 4 other teams who, oh, by the way, are getting better as well, who have brand new facilities. Florida with some new facilities. Georgia opened some new facilities a couple of years ago. South Carolina is in probably the heyday, maybe 5 or 6 years past the heyday of their football program. But again, their program on the rise. That's the point. So in the SEC East and the SEC West as well, it's not just about getting better, but you got to figure out who you're going to pass up, and then you have to beat those teams and pass them up. So yeah, Tennessee has a bad draw out of the West this year. There's no bad West team really. There hasn't been for a couple of years. Arkansas has been down a little bit, but they handed it to us last time we played them. I don't think Tennessee's beaten an East. Tennessee hasn't beaten a West team. Tennessee has a losing streak against every team in the SEC. So that's how bad things are in Knoxville right now. Vegas has us at 6.5, I believe, is the over-under for Tennessee. I would take the under on that right now. I think Jeremy Pruitt's a great coach. We've got to shore up the defense. Got gashed 2 years in a row on our rushing defense. We got to figure out what's going to be happening on offense. I think Kentucky's got a lot of guys coming back. I'll let Kevin talk about his team. Tennessee's going to have 30 guys starting when camp opens that weren't there for the spring, and several of those guys won't be there for the summer. The good part when we look at Tennessee, Kentucky this year, Tennessee will have had their team together. So I think Tennessee's got a good shot of being a much different team when they play Kentucky later in the season than they are when they play West Virginia or Florida earlier in the season. I really think Tennessee will look much better after Jeremy Pruitt and his coaching staff has a chance to develop. The talent is there. Tennessee has talent. A lot of people are saying, kind of the cupboard's dry. The cupboard's dry as far as development of that talent goes, but there is talent in Knoxville. And I think Tennessee's going to look a whole lot different in October when they play Kentucky, Vanderbilt, Missouri, than they're going to look early in the season when they play West Virginia and Florida. And they're certainly going to look quick.
Hey, Mike, real quick, the structure of the program trajectory for Tennessee that you just alluded to a minute ago spoke to where Butch Jones had this program just a few years ago in winning 9 games back-to-back, and it being difficult for the program, even despite the 3 consecutive top 15 recruiting classes and where the talent was for that team, even in a weakened SEC Eastern Division, to your point, to make the complete leap to the top of the division and the top of the conference. And then what we saw in postseason play, and I'm not going to blow out of proportion the results of one game, but it happened 3 consecutive years where Tennessee was matched up against a Big Ten-like seeded team and pretty much laid waste to the likes of Iowa, Northwestern, and Nebraska to a lesser degree 3 consecutive years.
Yeah, when you look at bowls, you and I both do this. We look at bowls comparisons to conferences. There's a little bit of fallacy in that because you have a whole month to get ready, and with Tennessee, you have a whole month to get healthy, and that helped. And then when you look at like a team like Nebraska and really Northwestern, you have a month to scheme against that rush, that rush first offense. Tennessee was able to look good against that. Of course, you look at 3 years ago, Tennessee was 21 points from being in the college football playoffs. That's how much talent they had. In retrospect, it's easy to say that we probably got coached out of 2 of those wins, particularly the Oklahoma game, where Baker Mayfield had the fourth quarter comeback there in Knoxville. And then we also lost to Alabama, of course, Arkansas, and Florida. Probably got coached out of that one. So, so we go from being 21 points and probably 4 minutes of clock time from being in the CFP. one year, and then 2 years later, and then we beat three straight years of hammering. I mean, we just absolutely destroyed Iowa, destroyed Northwestern, and handled Nebraska. We really didn't destroy them till last year, where we were winless in the SEC, even though we beat a pretty decent Georgia Tech team, but winless in the SEC. So that's how you live in the SEC on a razor's edge. You can go from 21 points out of the college football playoffs to winless in the SEC in 2 seasons, just like that. So in the SEC, you've got to recruit well, and you've got to develop players. You got to have a little bit of luck. You just have to build a solid foundation of a program. And I think that's what Kentucky fans should be happy about. Stoops is building a foundation. Tennessee fans are not happy with the direction their program's going. Hopefully Jeremy Pruitt can get that foundation solidified, but the talent's there. But yeah, just like you talked about, Mark, in the SEC East, in the SEC, you live on a razor's edge, and Kentucky knows. Kentucky fans and Tennessee fans, Tennessee fans recently know how it feels to kind of step back and fall off that ledge. Kentucky fans know how hard it is to get up on that ledge.
So Kentucky, Kevin, your support online says that you've got a top half of the conference defense and one of the top 25 teams in the nation. Also, we've got our guy, Navy Thomas 8, who believes that all these ex-Nebraska coaches on your coaching staff will pull you through. He's a Nebraska guy. So just speak to the Cats this season and what you're looking forward to. Coming off a pretty impressive bowl showing, despite a loss against a Northwestern team that had 10 wins. And if you watch the game gun to gun, it was, talk about razor close, as Mike alludes to, razor close in terms of decisions on the field by the coaching staffs, and razor close in regards to personnel on the field because of blown calls and decisions by the officials concerning player eligibility on the field. That one had to be tough to take.
Yeah, the Benny Snell, the most ridiculous ejection ever. Yeah, to go back to what Mike was saying real quick, talking about the SEC, South Carolina, with all their success they've had recently, Kentucky's beat them 4 years in a row now, which is, first time I think since the late 50s, early 60s, when they beat Florida 5 times in a row. They beat somebody other than Vanderbilt 4 years in a row in the conference. Looking to this year's team, the biggest question is still, was coming out of the spring, and it still is now, is who's going to be the quarterback. You got Gunnar Hoke, you've got Terry Wilson. Hoke has been in the system for a couple years now. He understands what, Eddie Grand and Darren Henshaw, the offensive, coordinators and quarterback coach, what they're looking for. And I said, Terry Wilson, he's very, haven't seen this much hype about a player in a long time, especially at Kentucky. And I think, Coach Stoops even said at one point after the spring game, we may even look at a platoon situation for the first game or two. They kick off with Central Michigan that first game, and that's not going to be an easy game at all. But like I said, whoever that quarterback, if you ask me right now, I still think going in September 1st, when the first team offense goes out, I think it's going to be Hoke. But that doesn't mean that by the middle of the season, the end of the season, Terry Wilson is not your starter, because I think I've talked about this. Terry Wilson did not come to Kentucky to sit on the bench. He came to be an impact player, and I think that's what he's going to be eventually. When you move past the quarterback, you got Benny Snell. In my opinion, I think he is the best back in the SEC. Now I know Georgia fans will differ, but Alabama fans may differ. But I think Snell is the best running back, and he's playing. He already kind of plays with a chip on his shoulder, and I think the events of the bowl game last year have just escalated that a little bit. I think he's worked like crazy in the offseason. As I told you earlier, he needs 1,412 yards to break the all-time record for rushing at Kentucky, and he's going to do that. Barring injury, barring anything unforeseen happening, he's going to break the record. And like I said, I think this will be his last year here in Lexington. The receivers are a question mark. Lynn Bowden is a guy we've talked about a lot. They're expecting big things out of him this year. They've got some good, some players who did some good things last year who are coming back. They got Dorian Baker, who missed last season with an injury. He's coming back. He's going to give them a huge lift. And the offensive line is solid. The defensive line is probably the one place where there's a question mark. Then you move to the linebackers. You've got Josh Allen, Jordan Jones. You've got those two guys. Josh Allen is a projected first-round pick, I think, by Mel Kiper in his the last mock draft that I saw. And then you move to the secondary. You got Mike Edwards, who's one of the best secondary guys in the SEC, and honestly in the nation. And you've got like possibly three guys who are legitimate first-team All-SEC guys, which is something you don't really see very much with the Kentucky football program in recent years.
All right, it's Rivalry Month here at Mark Rogers TV as we highlight Tennessee and Kentucky, and the Vols have a 79-25 all-time lead with 9 ties dating back to the 1890s. For Kentucky, as Kevin mentions, it's a date with Central Michigan to begin 2018, and then they don't have to wait long to try to break that 31-year streak in Gainesville at Florida. And for Tennessee, of course, they open up with West Virginia in Charlotte. Interesting non-conference matchup against one of the better teams and probably the best quarterback in the Big 12. And for Tennessee, if they can somehow get past the Mountaineers, they look to be 3-0 when they face the Gators later that month. And for these two, they get together once again for the 114th time, November 10th in Knoxville. For Mike Laval, last word on college football, Kevin McGuffey. Same platform. Last word on college football. Please join them for just some tremendous insight and perspective on the game we love, college football. Gentlemen, we appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate it. Always enjoyed hanging out and talking football.